Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. U.S. President Donald Trump has spoken about tensions between India and Pakistan over the recent Pulwama attack. He says the U.S. is seeking to de-escalate the situation, but looking at the U.S.'s recent track record, one has to doubt his intentions. Iran, for example, is holding Navy drills in the strategic Strait of Hormuz in response to U.S. actions vis-a-vis the Iran nuclear deal and sanctions. Russia, too, has warned it will retaliate to any negative U.S. moves regarding the INF Treaty and the production of missiles. We're going to discuss all of the above and more in today's show. Let's firstly listen, though, to Trump's statement, and we'll be back with our guests.
It's a terrible thing going on right now between Pakistan and India is a very, very bad situation, and it's a very dangerous situation between the two countries. And we would like to see it stop. A lot of people were just killed. And we want to see it stopped. We're very much involved in that, yes, if that's what you're referring to.
Well, our guests for this segment are former Ambassador Ayaz Wazir, who is joining us now from Islamabad. We're also joined by retired General Mohammad Mansha, who is a defense analyst, and he is joining us also from the Pakistani capital. Thank you both for joining us and for taking your time out to speak to us here in the Scope. General Mansha, if I could, I'd like to start with you. What did you make of Donald Trump's statement about the tensions between India and Pakistan?
Okay, let me say at the first place, it's unfortunate, the statement made by the Trump, but this is not something new. This has been the line of President Trump for quite some time. And if you go back, I think Ambassador will comment on that, actually there has been a nexus between India and the United States since 9/11. And if you go back to the history, that is the parliament, that is the Bombay, that is the Pathankot, Uri, and all that. These are the incidents where actually some kind of a pretext has been attempted to be created to replicate United States. Okay. But unfortunately, India is not, Pakistan is not United States, and Pakistan is not Afghanistan. That is to be clearly understood. Yeah. But in this environment, the relations between America and Pakistan has been taking some back and forth, and there is a clearly different line of the establishment and that of the president. And in my opinion, they would always go with the strategy of stick and carrot. They will try to make maximum space out of the environments. This whole development is linked with developments in the Afghanistan.
Okay, so let me bring that point then, if you allow me, to the ambassador. Ambassador Wazir, do you agree with the general there about his point of view about Trump's statement? And is this all, do you think, linked to the situation in Afghanistan?
Well, like anybody else, I would say President Trump is also concerned about the tense situation between India and Pakistan. Both are nuclear power, and both political leadership in both the countries have already given green signal to their armies to use force if they like to. So it is a very, very tense situation. Though I personally, in my individual capacity, I am quite comfortable India is not going to make that stupid mistake of crossing or attacking inside Pakistan. Because Pakistan has said it loud and clear, the Prime Minister, that we would not consider retaliation, but we would certainly retaliate. And then the nuclear powers, when they go into war, then there are no bars. Then in war you cannot say, don't use your force. So if that is used, obviously it is not only completely destructive for the two countries, but the regional and international world will certainly be deeply affected. Okay. And let's not forget America, in a way, is present around. They are sitting in Kabul, in Afghanistan. Yeah. And in addition to that, their supply line, aerial and ground, passes through Pakistan. So God forbid, if the war breaks between the two, then how are they going to supply to their own people? Even if there is no other loss to them, or the war is, say, a bit restricted, not Allah na kare, nuclear government can't think of. If that is used, then that is, Allah maafi de de, the end of the world. Because imagine both complete arsenal, if it is blown, then what happens to the world, to the entire world?
Let me bring that point then to General Mansha. Do you think, General, that Donald Trump and the U.S. establishment is looking at the situation with worry, simply before even American interests? As the ambassador there pointed out, Pakistan is important for the supply line to U.S. forces in Afghanistan as well.
I agree what the ambassador was saying, that we hope that they are concerned about the situation, and they also try and take cognizance of that is a kind of the situation which is warmongering being developed by the Indians. But what I am worried about is that sometime, what I said, the stick and carrot leads to some kind of a miscalculations. And as Ambassador was saying, both the armies have been given free hand, and smart little incidents, those get into the snowballing effect, and that leads to, that is the Holocaust. That is actually the concern, and that is the worry. Otherwise, because we are very clear, this incident has been just stage managed, it's a false flag, and it's clearly an allegation. If there was something which was tangible, then Pakistan would have been in a position to really respond to them or oblige to them. But the reality is there is nothing. It has been staged, and this is known by the Indians. This is known by the United States. This is only to pressurize Pakistan. This is to keep in check some of the developments Pakistan was making. Pakistan was clearly progressing. Pakistan was making some headway with the new government in its economy. And it was making some inroads into the overall global, that is diplomatic, their standing. They were improving. And in my opinion, the United States is not sincere to withdraw from from Afghanistan. They want to keep some kind of their presence, and they believe this can only be made possible if the support of Pakistan is given to them. And to seek that support, they seek the cooperation of India, and they do all kind of other diplomacy to put Pakistan under pressure.
Okay, so Ambassador, I wonder what you make of the timing of all of this. As General Mansha there said, this does seem like an odd time for all of this pressure to suddenly be put on Pakistan, isn't it? Considering, as General there said, Pakistan's economy seemed to be on the up, especially with all the Saudi investments that have recently come in. Not just that, of course, the country has seen terrorist attacks go down drastically over the recent years. Beyond that, of course, we've just had, free and fair elections in the country, a new prime minister in office. All of that shows Pakistan on the up. This is a convenient time, isn't it, on the part of India to have brought all this up?
Well, in addition to that, the Indian, I think, felt left out in the Afghan process. Nobody bothers about India, though India has spent a lot of money inside there. A lot of investment was made, and America always used to, President Trump particularly, asking India to play a little more important role in Afghanistan. But since the talk started, nobody talks of India, so they are left over. One is that, and then there are changes coming in the region. Look at the Saudi investment in Gwadar. Look at the Qatari investment in the country. They both are very close to the United States. And the United States certainly has deep interest in the region and serious concerns about CPEC. But now the close aids have come to Gwadar. The rest, if one doesn't speak, I think would be better. But America's interest is better, in a way, served. Concerns are addressed. So the economy was set on the right track. China was also happy with it. It has no serious concern. So the area was coming to stability without India. And obviously, India wants its role to play. Otherwise, Pulwama, now everything has come out in the media. Even the Kashmiris themselves are accusing Modi of shifting unnecessarily the blame to Pakistan because look at the rest of Kashmir. What is happening? Complete uprising. Nobody wants to stay with India. Have you seen any spot on earth where any country has more than 700,000 troops to control such a little population? Look at America in Afghanistan, how many there were. It was a complete war. In Iraq, how many there were. A complete war in two big countries. The Indians have much more troops in Kashmir than the U.S. had in all these wars, and still cannot control. India has lost Kashmir, whether they like it or not. Indian policies are creating trouble.
If you allow me, then, Ambassador, I wanted to pick up on your mention of Kashmir because I'm glad you brought that up. General Mansha, all of this goes back to Kashmir, doesn't it? That one major outstanding issue between India and Pakistan. And, you know, Prime Minister Khan has repeatedly said, let's negotiate, let's talk at the very least, maturely around a table about this issue, and let's resolve it. And this, of course, has been repeated by Pakistan over the years, a number of times. Do you think that this all is essentially deflection, essentially, on the part of India from that issue of Kashmir, which is still outstanding?
Absolutely. This is due to deforestation caused to the Indians. They have not been able to suppress, that is, the indigenous movement. And now you see that is Kashmiri youth, they're out in the open. They are not scared of the death. They welcome the death. And that is, as the ambassador said, 700,000 troops of Indian have not been able to suppress the movement. This is one frustration. Other is, as ambassador said, they have not been able to yield the desired results of the investment they made in Afghanistan. And I would go to that extent, even investing in some of our domestic fronts. They see that the investment that has been that has gone really bad investment. And under this frustration, they want to seek the support of United States. And that is what my worry is, that under this environment, under the frustration, there might be some miscalculations. Because any miscalculations, Pakistan cannot afford to take any kind of aggression, because it's a battle, it's our survival. We are not going for any aggression. We are not getting into anybody's business, but we have all the right to live with dignity and live with all the honor. And I think our political leadership, that is the military establishment, they have responded in a very mature manner, and they have given all the options of the negotiations. They have given even the options if due some proofs are given. We are open to investigations. They have offered everything. But then at the end, they have also given them the warning that should somebody try to take some advantage, then please do not underestimate us.
Okay, so Ambassador Wazir, I wonder how you assess, in fact, as General Mansha there said, Pakistan's stances throughout, not just this issue vis-a-vis Pulwama, because, you know, as the General there mentioned, Pakistan has been very open and said, listen, if you have evidence, then present it. Let's talk about this, because terrorism is an issue which affects Pakistan too and is of concern to Pakistan as well. And then beyond that, of course, we have this case of Yadav, at the ICJ and the International Court of Justice as well, which, of course, India brought forth itself about Kulbhushan Yadav. I wonder what you make of all of that and Pakistan's maturity in how it's approached all of that.
Well, I would add into what the Prime Minister said about terrorism. If you recall, our argument to the Indian argument, whenever they would say that, well, we would talk to Pakistan on terrorism, obviously meant that we would not touch Kashmir, because on Kashmir they are not talking to us, they have decided. But this time, on this particular issue, our Prime Minister crossed even the red line and said, okay, yes, let's talk about terrorism. But that even he is not able, Modi, to come and talk, because in this, obviously, he cannot prove that Pakistan is involved. Accusing somebody is extremely easy, but to prove that person to be involved in that crime or in that act is almost impossible. So how come Indian immediately jumped into that since the claim was made by a certain individual, so Pakistani government is involved? It can be anywhere. Let's say the 9/11 could have been claimed or even was claimed by so many, but the American went after one person. Now here, the Modi Sarkar closing its eyes from the fact, straight away went against Pakistan, not thinking for a minute as to what was happening in the valley for the last so many years. Complete uprising of this scale I have yet to see anywhere else in the country, and Modi is closing his eyes from fact. The problem lies within India. It doesn't lie anywhere else. He is to search the problem within India. He is to address it within India. And he is to give the Kashmiris a free hand to decide their fate, like was agreed in the resolution of the United Nations, where their prime minister went and we agreed. We said, okay, we agreed to a free and fair plebiscite in Kashmir.
Very well, Ambassador. We'll have to leave that as our final word, but of course that's a very appropriate sentiment to end this specific segment on. We of course appreciate both of your times and insight and analysis on this topic. That was former Ambassador Ayaz Wazir speaking to us from Islamabad. We were also joined by retired General Mohammad Mansha, who is also a defense analyst, and he had been speaking to us from the Pakistani capital as well. Viewers, there at the end, as Ambassador Wazir said, this does come back to internal Indian issues and the issue, of course, outstanding issue of Kashmir and India's occupation of that territory. Donald Trump's statement, of course, at this time not helpful in the way that he, of course, termed it. But we'll keep a very close eye on U.S. involvement, if any, in this ongoing tensions between India and Pakistan here in the scope. Don't go anywhere, though. I'll be back after a short break with our next segment. Thank you very much for staying with us here in the scope, viewers. In this segment, we're going to discuss staying with, of course, U.S. actions globally. But this time, we're going to talk about Navy drills being held by the Islamic Republic of Iran. To discuss that a bit further, we're joined now by former Ambassador Javid Husain, who is joining us right here from Lahore on the line. Ambassador Husain, thanks for joining us here in the scope. Ambassador, this is a time, of course, of great tension between the United States and several nations, and of course the U.S. and Iran. The tensions are quite obvious for the world to see when it comes to the nuclear deal and the sanctions, etc. Iran has a number of times, as you know, Ambassador, warned that it would even close the Strait of Hormuz if its oil shipments were to be zeroed out as Trump wants. In that context, now, how important are these Navy drills by Iran?
Well, I see, in my estimation, these drills are a defensive measure by Iran to, first of all, to demonstrate its naval capabilities and to then send a message to any country like U.S. or any other country in the region which may be planning any aggressive action against Iran, that Iran would be prepared to use all its might, whether in the form of naval forces or other forces, to protect its and safeguard its legitimate interests, which of course would include export of its oil through the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world. So basically, it's a defensive measure. And the purpose is to demonstrate Iran's naval capabilities in various fields of maritime warfare.
And, you know, Ambassador, the U.S. would turn around and say that Iran is being provocative. The U.S. would say Iran is being aggressive, that its actions vis-a-vis the Strait of Hormuz, vis-a-vis the Persian Gulf, etc., are not helpful to diffuse tensions in the region. What do you make of those sentiments?
I think that would not be an accurate reading of the situation, because Iran had signed a nuclear deal with the U.S. and other permanent members of the Security Council, as well as Germany, And Iran has stuck and adhered to and implemented the provisions of that nuclear deal. It is the United States which has raised tension by withdrawing from that nuclear deal and reimposing its sanctions against Iran. So if anybody has been guilty of provocation, and it is the United States itself. And I think the international community cannot be hoodwinked by merely propaganda. We can see the realities on the ground.
Yeah.
Even the latest report from the International Atomic Energy Agency says that Iran so far has been faithfully implementing all the provisions of the nuclear deal which it had signed with the Western countries as well as with Russia and China. So there was no justification for U.S. to withdraw it from it unilaterally. And therefore, the primary responsibility for the rising tensions between Iran and U.S. or other countries lies with the United States itself.
Okay, so, a lot of people would say, Ambassador, that the U.S. is marching towards war with Iran ever so slowly or quickly, depending on who you ask, because we have, John Bolton as part of Trump's cabinet, and we know his point of view towards Iran. Do you think that the U.S. is vying for war with Iran?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer, but my assessment or my feeling is that United States would not go that far.
Okay.
Because the consequences of such an open war or declaration of war against Iran would be so horrendous for the region, for that, and the international community itself would also see who is aggressor. So, and that would have very serious implications for U.S. interests, not only in the region but also globally. So I think U.S. would perhaps not go that far, but short of that, U.S. May be doing things that are aimed at hurting Iran economically, politically, and even from the security point of view.
But that in and of itself is warfare of sorts, isn't it, Ambassador? I mean, economic warfare, whatever you want to term it, really. And I imagine that obviously the Iranians would not look kindly upon that, and they would react. So all of that pressure and putting Iran into the corner, that will create some sort of a reaction, won't it?
Yes, it would certainly generate some. It has already generated some reaction from Iran, and it would do it in future also. And I think, but Iran's first reliance would be on a diplomatic response to this pressure by developing closer cooperation with countries like Russia and China and countries in the region, and with a view to strengthening its security position, its economic interest. So I don't think even Iran would be keen to rush into a war-like situation with the United States. After all, United States remains still the most powerful military, force or country in the world, and no other country would be keen to enter into a direct military conflict with the United States. But still, at the same time, it has to protect its own interests, and therefore its interests perhaps would be best served by strengthening its security cooperation, economic cooperation with other countries, major countries, especially countries like China and Russia.
Very well, Ambassador. We'll leave that as our final word, this specific issue. But of course, as always, we appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule to speak to us here in the scope. That was former Ambassador Javid Husain, who was speaking to us on the line from right here in Lahore. Viewers, we will continue to talk about U.S. Actions throughout the world. After this break, we're going to talk about U.S. actions vis-a-vis Russia and the INF Treaty. Stay with us for that. Thank you for staying with us here in the scope, viewers, as we continue to discuss U.S. actions throughout the world. In this segment, we want to discuss the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. that had been signed by both the United States and Russia. Donald Trump, that is, has said that he will walk away from that treaty. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined now by Mr. Alexander Bratersky, who is a senior foreign policy writer for Gazeta.ru. He's also been previously a Moscow Times political reporter as well, and he covers Russian-American relationships amongst other expertise. And he's joining us now from Moscow. Alexander, thank you for your time and for joining us here in The Scope. What did you make, Alexander, of President Putin's warning to America about restarting, its own missile program, considering Trump has announced that he will walk away from the INF?
I think this is a very logical step from President Putin. He can be blamed for a lot of things about domestic policy, but as far as foreign policy, he was very precise in that particular matter. For many years, he has warned the United States for not walking away from these treaties. There was a famous 1972 treaty on missile defense, and missile shield in Moscow and the United States. The U.S. under President Bush has walked away from this treaty. And President Putin has warned that that's a very dangerous thing for the world. Of course, the treaty was very fundamental. The INF treaty signed by President Gorbachev and President Reagan. Yeah. But then President Trump is making the statements. There's no reason for President Putin not to do this. Although I do say that probably there were violations on the both sides. Both Russia and U.S. have violated. And I think blame should not be put on just one country. But this is possible to actually verify and to actually find agreements if both countries are interested to do that.
Okay, so then that's that final word that you just said, that both countries' interests in doing so. At this point in time, it doesn't seem like the United States is in a very talkative move about this topic. Am I correct to say that?
I think you're absolutely correct. But the other thing is that if we do see that the United States is not doing if they keep their promises, if they're not really putting the missiles to Europe, that's even without this treaty, the situation is still be bearable, right? Because they say they need those weapons to actually cover China. Ironically, to say that President Gorbachev and President Reagan signed that treaty in 1987, I'm sorry. Gorbachev pulled out Russia's Soviet rockets from China because he wanted to establish a better relationship with China. And, Russian relations with China are now good, but however, you should always keep your friends and sort of on a distance in that particular reason. So I think Putin is very logical. If Trump doesn't do that, doesn't put the missiles in Europe, then actually Russia would not do that. The same. And I also want to point out Alexander Lukashenko, Russia's ally, the president of Belarus, also said that Russia and Belarus would also consider steps. Belarus is a neutral state, but they don't have nuclear weapons. But he still sends a warning. We're gonna put maybe something. That's dangerous.
So why do you think, Alexander, that the United States would choose this time to walk away from the INF? Because, as you said, there have probably been violations on both sides, in your understanding. So then why not negotiate? Why not talk? Why make the drastic decision to walk away from a treaty which is genuinely so important for global peace?
Well, the hardline Republicans in the Trump administration are actually pushing him to do that. Maybe Trump doesn't really care about any of this stuff. And of course, John Bolton, I know Bolton personally, he's very smart and very, very conservative, very precise guy. He always hated those treaties. If Democrats will be in power, I mean, Mrs. Clinton is maybe blamed for a lot of things in the Russian-American relationship, but I don't think so. Mrs. Clinton would walk away from this treaty. Democrats would definitely keep the treaty because the treaty was made, was actually a cornerstone to sort of a balance in Europe and so on. But I think Trump is actually pressured by the people inside the administration, and of course, that's also possible that Trump is pushing Putin to negotiate, again, and let's make another treaty. Let's put China in that treaty. That's also possible because President Trump wants to be President Reagan. I don't know if President Putin wants to be President Gorbachev, but President Trump really wants to be something, in that foreign policy treaty kind of stuff.
Do you think that President Putin wants to be a part of a renegotiation? Because I imagine that no country like Russia, which is a large power in the world, would want to be, humiliated, if I may use that word, in this fashion, forced into negotiations. I imagine that the Russians would not like that.
Absolutely, absolutely. But Russians are also, smart and also tactical. So that definitely. Just recently, we have a very negative relationship right now as far as United States and Russia is concerned. But recently, before just our program began, I've read in the news, but the U.S. Military plane flew over Russian territory. And of course, this clickable kind of journalism, but, you think, oh, yeah, what's happened? But that's U.S. plane which flies over Russian territory because of the agreement of the open sky. The Americans fly over Russian territory. That's a good sign that both countries are still talking about all those things. And I think that it is possible for Russia and U.S. to come to some kind of agreement, maybe not to a new treaty, but maybe to sort of like an agreement that the missiles, both sides will keep down. But probably that's only going to happen if Trump wins the elections again, or a new president, let's say a Democrat, will come over to the office. And then, of course, he will deal with the same President Putin. But probably there's something going to be after elections. But I don't expect anything before the elections in the United States.
Okay, so how much do you think, Alexander, of this goes to that feeling in the United States that it is losing its place on top of the world? The U.S. establishment, many people say, still lives in a world, in its mind at least, that is unipolar. But, everyone talks about a multipolar world now. And Russia, of course, is involved in many spheres around the world now, be it Venezuela, be it Syria, etc. So do you think this is also America acting out in a way against Russia?
It is. Partly it is. But, let's say also, let's face the truth. I mean, the biggest part of the message delivered by President Putin to this was Russia's State of the Nation address was actually dedicated to the, welfare and poor state of the Russian economy. We are a global power. We're sending Marines, we're sending sleek helicopters around the world, and our people are marching under the Russian flag, while our people are still living in a state of poverty, and our economy is not really doing well. So people actually get angry. I talk to a lot of people, say, why we need a lot of weapons, why we need a lot of weaponry, a lot of missiles, while, we live not well. And, so that's also extreme. We need weapons, of course, to keep peace, but we also need our people to go wealthy, right? So, of course, Americans know about that. So they're actually keeping and pressuring us to do, but this situation would not happen. Like, we will not going to sort of surrender, but there should be a smart move, because otherwise we'll again get into this race. What's happened to President Gorbachev when he signed the treaty? He saw that people actually, standing in line to buying accessories, while we are producing so much weapons, and of course he was thinking about the world peace. But now I think that the situation is different. But I don't want Putin to walk in the shoes of Mr. Gorbachev, where he will have, crumbled economy and actually sort of producing missiles, which I am for the missiles to keep peace, but I'm not for the missiles to threaten, so that's my position.
But I wonder, Alexander, do the Russian people contextualize the economic difficulties along with, of course, the sanctions that have been placed on Russia since we know the Ukraine crisis, etc.? Does that come into play in all this?
Of course, all of this, and actually continuing military actions in Syria, although people actually thinking that's going to be some kind of peace soon. That makes people angry. We need a strong military, and thanks God, yes, I remember 20 years ago, Russian soldiers on the street begged for cigarettes, right? And I don't want to repeat this situation. Every country like Pakistan, Russia, India, China, we need strong military. But that military should not be made at the expense of the people's wealth and the people's life, And, some people are saying, of course, our relation with the United States will not be good for, let's say, 2.5 years. But let's do something for the economy, right, first.
Okay, so let's add another voice to this conversation. We're now joined by Mr. Sergei Strokan, who is a geopolitical analyst. He's an observer at Kommersant and is a Moscow-based geopolitical analyst and observer with Kommersant Publishing House, I should say. Sergei, thank you for taking your time out to join us here in the scope. Sergei, I wanted to get your thoughts. Alexander Bratersky, they were saying about the Russian economy and how much is being spent in global, areas that Russia is involved in. Do you think that Russia also needs to take a step back, possibly, and concentrate more on its internal issues rather than this seemingly this global stance that is against American interests?
Well, there's an ongoing controversy over what would be Russia's response. And some were saying that probably when Americans are pulling out of this treaty, Russia would have to be dragged into the arms race, which, as you remember, was sort of a devastating blow for the Soviet Union. So there's ongoing confusion, and many people are saying that probably we are risking or getting involved into an arms race which we simply won't be able to afford ourselves. But at the same time, some analysts argue that this time it will be totally different. So it will be not just repetition what we had during the time of the Cold War, and simply instead of making stake on high-cost weapon programs, we will be involved in what is described here by military analysts as asymmetric answer. The basic difference of asymmetric answer is that we are not going to make the adequate number of weapons, missiles. But we would select certain areas where we are going ahead of Americans, and would be able to produce 2, 3, maybe 5 missiles, which Americans don't have. And this will nullify probably the advantage which they won't want to get. So it's more sophisticated, And it seems that we are going to use this way now.
Okay. So, if I may, Alexander, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Do you think that there will be an arms race now? Because in many ways, in my reading, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Russia doesn't really have a choice, does it? Because America seems to be becoming more aggressive around the world. I mean, we can talk about Venezuela, we can talk about many other areas around the world. That aggressiveness, I imagine that Russia feels it needs to respond to, even NATO expansionism close to its borders.
But let's say for a certain reason, President Putin is also he's a pragmatic guy. He's not some kind of crazy lunatic, often portrayed in the American media as a kind of a guy who wants to take over the world. Of course, he's a pragmatic, but sometimes he's surrounded by experts in the military complex. The military always want to produce more missiles, right? Yes, I agree with Sergei that the answer will be more precise, but all answers are actually to push other side to negotiate. You show your arms, you show what you have in order to negotiate, because I think the negotiation will finally take place, let's say, in a year or two about, more. Because the situation in the world developing so rapidly, I remember you and I were Cold War kids. We all remember that, kind of those missiles are kind of the missiles which can be used only as a last resort. But now you have more people on TV, the younger people, younger generation, who feel it's throwing a rocket or two is fine. So, this is a dangerous situation. So, if sane politicians around the world will definitely talk about this, right?
So, Sergei, that's a good point that Alexander made, Sergei. Do you think that is a higher chance of miscalculation in a case where if America walks away from the INF and NATO continues to expand and Russia feels like it's put into a corner, do you think that there is a chance of actual war?
I don't think there's a sort of chance for a war, The topic of war is good for journalists, for headlines, for clicks. But when it comes to war, there's a lot of talk, everywhere. It's not only between Russia and America. Look at the map of the globe and see how many countries are involved in the blame game and muscle flexing and warmongering rhetoric. But this is something different. When it comes to war, there's all sides would think twice. But of course, what is dangerous? I don't want to sound too optimistic, but what is dangerous is that we see an erosion of this IMF treaty, and what is embarrassing is that Americans being unhappy with the treaty, and probably we can understand their reason because this is a bilateral treaty, and there are many countries like China, India, and Pakistan which are developing their own missiles. That instead of frankly telling us that, look, this is an outdated treaty, Let us sit and think over making some multilateral agreement. Instead of that, Americans are putting blame on Russia, accusing it of violations of the treaty, which never took place. So that's not fair, and this is what President Putin has said in his address to the parliament.
That's a very good point, Alexander. I wanted to bring up a point, if I may, Alexander, and that about domestic American politics. We know, Alexander, from day one, since Donald Trump came into office, he's been blamed that his campaign colluded with Russia. Do you think a lot of those domestic politics and that whole Russia investigation and that anti-Russia hysteria within the U.S. is playing a very large factor in how America views Russia right now?
A lot, absolutely. Everything which is connected to Russia is currently so toxic that for President Trump to at least to propose something positive would be very negative. I mean, like, you remember Ambassador Sergei was called a man who actually, has a ring of spy. Has never been a Russian ambassador, and never been proclaimed a spy in any country. And I know Mr. Kislyak was, of course, nothing to do with spying work. But all of those offensive things are actually making the situation worse. So we'll definitely see something, maybe relief, or maybe even the situation might actually go worse after the Mueller report is produced in the United States. So we definitely see that. I actually believe there was some kind of meddling by Russia, but meddling in a sort of like meddling, quote unquote. I mean, maybe there was some kind of like, people who've been posting some stuff on the internet, but I don't think so. That's possible, for Russia to, interfere in such a scale that Americans would, no people in Pakistan or India would elect someone on behalf of some other country. This is bullshit. I'm sorry to say that word, but that's definitely not. But of course, because Russia is toxic, everything that Trump does is with Russia good is actually can be seen as sort of like he's a betrayer, a Russian spy, an officer with Russian politics. I don't know what they can call him.
And then in such a situation, then, Sergei, it's very hard to see, isn't it, sir, these two major powers working together on anything around the world. I mean, we can talk about Syria. There is a need for a political solution there. Will these two countries be able to work together in Syria? Will they be able to even work together when it comes to Venezuela, for example, or even Ukraine?
I'm quite pessimistic, because if you look at American domestic political agenda, the problem is that there's no demand for alternative Russian politics, and there's striking consensus between Democrats and Republicans over the policy which is aimed to withstand Russia, to deter Russia, to knee Russia down, to make Russia change its position, and this is, as I understand, a non-starter for any negotiations. At the same time, it looks that President Putin is also running out of patience. Look what he said a couple of weeks back, that we will never beg for negotiations with Americans more. Let us go ahead with our missile programs. And once Americans are ready, once they realize the danger, then probably we will get back to negotiations. But he personally instructed two ministries, foreign ministry and defense ministry, not to take any action to be involved in negotiations. This shows that probably we are understanding that in present situation, in present environment, we are not in a position to pay huge bills of American domestic politics. It's not fair, The other thing is that high hopes initially were pinned on President Trump here.
Yeah.
And very few people were saying that Trump is a big zero and we can hardly expect anything from him. So what he was saying on Twitter, that he wants to talk to Russia, that was just simply blah, blah. So now it seems that slowly and reluctantly, we reconsider that the damage which was done to U.S.-Russian relations during President Trump outweighs all the damage which was made during the time after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So now we're at the rock bottom place. Such things never happened even during the time of the Cold War. So this is something very serious.
Alexander, both Russia and the United States are permanent members of the UN Security Council. So then, as I put it to Sergei there, Alexander, I wonder then, with these two countries and their disagreement becoming ever so larger on a daily basis, world peace sort of is also at stake, isn't it? Considering they both have veto power and they can choose to, antagonize the other at the UN and leave many situations around the world, and we can talk about many of them, unresolved.
That's all. Yeah, you're correct. Both sides are still talking on maybe on lower level. I know the relationship between the militaries in Syria are not bad, and Russian commanders and American commanders are talking to each other. Still, senators. Actually, in private conversations, both Americans and Russian military people expressed very warm feelings toward each other. They say the Russians are really good and quality officers, we can trust them, and so on. That's if they have a command from Washington. The thing is, Afghanistan is actually a major issue right now. So both countries to say we just we just celebrate the anniversary of pulling out our troops from Afghanistan. So Americans are kind of learning about our experience, and there are talks, and and actually. U.S. Special Ambassador Khalizad has expressed good things about Russia's talks with unofficial talks with Taliban people here in Moscow. So there are still areas we can cooperate despite huge disagreements. And I would also recall you the 70s situation then Soviet leader Brezhnev and Nixon. Yeah. Of course, nobody accused Brezhnev of meddling in U.S. affairs, but still,
Okay, we'll leave that as our final word, but of course we appreciate both of you taking your time out, and I know it's a holiday in Russia, so we appreciate you taking your time out of this busy day to speak to us there from Russia. That was Alexander Bratersky, foreign policy expert, and we were also joined by Mr. Sergei Strokan, geopolitical analyst. Of course, as I said, we appreciate their time and their analysis. Now, viewers, in this show, we've gone through the entire breadth, we've tried to at least, of the most latest and contemporary geopolitical issues when it comes to the United States and its actions around the world. We started off with, of course, Trump's statements about the tensions between India and Pakistan currently, and then, of course, about Iran's Navy drills that, of course, in response, according to Iran at least, to U.S. sanctions and U.S. action globally, especially, of course, towards Iran. And then, of course, Russia and President Putin's warning vis-a-vis the INF Treaty and missiles. We'll keep a very close eye on all of those developments here in The Scope. But that's all from me for the moment. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.